Lady Celeste Whitmore lost everything when she trusted her heart to the wrong man. Now, she seeks only anonymity among the dusty books of the Blackwood estate. Duke Alexander Ashford is famous for his calculated coldness, using his charm as an impenetrable armor against love. They had the perfect formula to ignore each other. But when her distance becomes an irresistible challenge, Alexander decides to break his own rules. In a careful game of proximity, Celeste must choose, keep running, or risk her only defense for love. But before any spark of attraction could shatter these walls, there was only the chill of a lonely arrival and the heavy weight of planned isolation. The carriage stopped before the immense oak doors of the Blackwood estate, but Lady Celeste Whitmore barely registered the grandeur of the stone facade. Her gaze remained fixed on her own hands, occupied with meticulously smoothing the folds of her grey cotton gloves. The simple fabric was more than an article of clothing. It was a barrier, a silent promise that she would neither touch nor be touched by the outside world. The ruin of her last engagement had taught her a brutal lesson about the dangers of trust, leaving invisible scars that now dictated her every movement. By accepting the task of cataloguing the immense and neglected library of the Duke of Ashford, Celeste sought only one thing: the refuge of anonymity. She adjusted her posture and stepped down from the carriage, determined to be nothing more than a ghost among the shelves. If she was careful, the Duke would not even notice she was there. The first few days at Blackwood passed exactly as Celeste had planned. The estate's library was a forgotten sanctuary, a labyrinth of towering mahogany shelves that smelled of aged leather and beeswax. Sunlight poured through the tall windows in dust-laden beams, illuminating the thousands of volumes awaiting her methodical hands. It was exhausting work, demanding absolute focus on dates and worn spines, but it was the kind of exhaustion that kept her mind safe. There was no room for painful memories when deciphering the handwriting of a 16th-century scholar. She developed a strict routine. She descended for breakfast before the servants finished setting the main table, ate in silence in the small morning room, and disappeared into the library until dusk. The household staff quickly grew accustomed to the quiet archivist with the silent footsteps, whose neutral-tone dresses seemed designed to blend into the tapestry-covered walls. On the other side of the estate, Duke Alexander Ashford maintained his own routine, governed by impeccable order and an efficient lack of sentiment. Alexander had inherited not only a title, but a vast fortune that made him the constant target of the social ambitions of half the noble families in England. After years of dodging matrimonial traps, he had perfected an armor of courteous, impenetrable charm. He smiled at the right moments, said the correct words, but never allowed anyone to cross the line of pleasant superficiality. His estate was his domain, a place where logic reigned absolute. When his steward suggested hiring someone to organize the East Wing Library, Alexander merely nodded and signed the document, forgetting the matter the very next moment. He had assumed Miss Whitmore was a middle-aged woman, perhaps the widow of some collector, who would spend her days sneezing among folios of classical poetry. Their first encounter was entirely unplanned. It was late afternoon on a rainy Tuesday. Alexander needed a specific reference regarding the hunting rights on one of his tenanted lands, and recalled an old treatise resting somewhere in the East Wing. Pushing open the heavy double doors of the library, he expected to find the usual silent emptiness. Instead, he found Celeste. She was standing near the top of a wooden ladder, struggling to balance a stack of 3 thick books against her chest, while reaching for a 4th on the top shelf. Her slate blue dress fell in unforgiving folds around her slender figure, and a solitary curl of brown hair had escaped her severe chignon, resting against the pale curve of her neck. The sound of the door closing echoed through the room. Celeste startled. The book her fingers were just grazing slipped from the shelf and plummeted. Alexander moved with surprising speed, extending his hand to intercept the heavy volume before it shattered against the marble floor. The dull thud of leather against his palm sounded loud in the sudden silence. He glanced up at the woman on the ladder, his charming, automatic smile forming on his lips. I believe gravity was about to claim one of my first editions. Miss Whitmore, I presume. Celeste looked down at him. Her eyes, an impossibly clear shade of gray, widened for a fraction of a second before a mask of icy politeness slammed down over her features. She did not smile. She did not reach up to tuck away the stray curl. With careful, measured movements, she descended the ladder, keeping the other 3 books pressed tightly to her chest like a shield. When her feet touched the floor, she did not step forward to retrieve the dropped volume. Instead, she took a subtle, deliberate step back. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low, melodious, but entirely devoid of inflection. "I apologize for the carelessness. The binding was loose, and I miscalculated the weight." Alexander held out the book, waiting for her to close the distance. "No harm done. I see you are making remarkable progress here." Rather than reaching for it, Celeste gestured toward a nearby reading table with a rigid movement of her gloved hand. "You may leave it on the table, if you please. I shall log it in a moment." Alexander's smile faltered by a fraction of a millimeter. He slowly lowered his arm and placed the book exactly where she had indicated. There was a clear, almost tactile rejection in her refusal to come near him. "Is the work to your liking?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. He was accustomed to commanding the center of any room. This woman's silent refusal to engage with him was profoundly disconcerting. "It is a perfectly adequate position, Your Grace. The library is quiet, and the records are reasonably intact. If there is nothing else, I have a schedule to maintain in this section." She was dismissing him, in his own house. The quiet audacity of the act surprised him so much he almost laughed. "I shall not interrupt you further then, though I confess I came in search of a document regarding county tenancy laws. Have you come across anything of the sort?" A. Shelf 16, Agrarian Law Section. Your Grace, the 3rd bookcase to your left. "The tenancy ledgers are on the bottom shelf, organized by year," she recited with robotic efficiency. Alexander looked in the indicated direction, then back to Celeste. She had already turned her back to him, stepping toward a side table and beginning to scratch notes into a formidable-looking ledger. The tense curve of her shoulders made it abundantly clear that as long as he remained in the room, she would not relax. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore," he murmured, walking to the shelf and easily locating the leather-bound folder. As he glanced over his shoulder before exiting the library, he fully expected to catch her watching him, but Celeste remained with her back turned, the tip of her quill scratching against parchment, entirely absorbed in her task, or pretending to be, with staggering conviction. Alexander pulled the library doors shut and stood in the corridor for a long moment, the tenancy document forgotten in his hand. He did not understand it. The charm he wore as armor to keep the world at a safe distance had not simply failed. It had crashed against an impassive stone wall. Miss Whitmore had not looked at him with disguised interest, nor with the typical reverence of someone standing before a powerful title. She had looked at him as if he were an obstacle in the middle of the room, an inconvenience she wished to remove as quickly as possible so she could return to her quiet safety. That involuntary step back when she reached the bottom of the ladder, the cotton gloves covering her hands even indoors, the deliberate, trained rigidity in her voice. She was hiding. Alexander frowned, walking toward his study on the opposite side of the estate. He was not a man given to chasing other people's mysteries. Emotional complications were exactly what he avoided at all costs. Yet, as he sat behind his heavy desk and attempted to read the dull tenancy reports, the image of Celeste's guarded gray eyes kept interrupting his thoughts. He hated the smell of old books. He hated the fine dust that inevitably clung to the heavy carpets of the East Wing. But the following day, shortly after luncheon, Alexander found himself inexplicably canceling his usual solitary afternoon ride. He looked at the stack of unread correspondence on his desk, released a long sigh, and stood up with a sudden burst of energy. Surely, he reasoned with impeccable logic, there was an obscure atlas, or perhaps an old diary of some colorful ancestor, that he suddenly felt the extreme urgency to examine in person, merely to ensure the new archivist was adapting properly to her working environment, of course. With decisive steps that betrayed the contained lightness of his smile, the Duke of Ashford took the long way back to the library. It began with a sudden, inexplicable interest in the structural integrity of ancient Greek temples. On Wednesday, Alexander appeared in the library just after 2 o'clock, requesting a specific volume on Doric columns. On Thursday, it was a sudden, pressing inquiry regarding the quality of the ink the estate provided to its employees, which required him to stand entirely too close to her desk to examine her ledgers. By Friday, he had abandoned the pretense of specific requests altogether, resorting to pacing the long aisles under the guise of looking for a fictional journal written by a great-uncle he wasn't entirely sure had ever existed. Celeste's icy composure was tested with every heavy creak of the oak doors. She tried desperately to maintain her rigid efficiency, answering his questions with clipped, polite sentences and strictly refusing to meet his gaze. When he entered a row of shelves, she quietly exited it. When he approached her desk, she found a reason to climb the rolling ladder. Yet, the Duke possessed a stubborn, quiet gravity that pulled relentlessly at her meticulously constructed walls. He did not treat her like a servant, barking orders or demanding submission, nor did he treat her like a social conquest, showering her with the aggressive, superficial flattery she had learned to despise in London. He simply occupied space near her. He would lean against the mahogany shelves, arms crossed over his tailored waistcoats, and watch her catalogue with a patient intensity that made her gloved hands tremble ever so slightly. The worst part was not his persistence. It was her own traitorous reaction. She found herself listening for his distinct, measured footsteps in the corridor. She caught herself pausing her quill when the afternoon sun hit a certain angle on the floorboards, wondering what absurd excuse he would invent to visit her today. This realization terrified her. Anticipation was the first step toward hope, and hope was the poison that had nearly destroyed her a year ago. To combat this dangerous weakness, Celeste began altering her schedule. When she anticipated his afternoon visit, she abandoned her ledgers and fled the library, seeking sanctuary outdoors. During her first week, she had discovered an overgrown, abandoned rose garden on the far western edge of the estate. It was a magnificent tangle of wild briars, crumbling stone benches, and pathways swallowed by moss, a place entirely forgotten by the meticulous groundskeepers who maintained the front lawns. It suited her perfectly. Here, surrounded by sharp thorns and untamed nature, she could breathe without the suffocating weight of Alexander's gaze. She could press her cotton-clad hands against the cold, weathered stone of a broken fountain, and remind herself of the iron-clad rules she had sworn to live by. Safety in distance. Peace in isolation. Her sanctuary remained undiscovered for exactly 3 days. On the 4th afternoon, the heavy crunch of boots on gravel shattered the quiet of the garden. Celeste stiffened, her spine going rigid as she kept her eyes fixed on a sprawling mess of crimson climbers. She did not need to turn to know who had found her. I was informed by the head housekeeper that my archivist had vanished into the wilderness. Alexander's voice floated over the rustling leaves, laced with dry, unmistakable amusement. Celeste took a slow breath, refusing to turn around. "I am taking my permitted 30 minutes of air, Your Grace. The dust of the archives is quite dense today." "Indeed," Alexander murmured, his footsteps drawing closer until he came to a stop a few feet beside her. She risked a sideways glance. He was not wearing his formal riding coat, just a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms and a dark waistcoat, looking entirely too comfortable among the ruins. He surveyed the chaotic blooms with a thoughtful expression. This part of the grounds has been neglected for years. It is hardly a pleasant place for a stroll, Miss Whitmore. There are far more accommodating gardens near the south wing. I find it preferable to the manicured lawns, she replied softly, staring straight ahead. There is an honesty in things that are allowed to grow as they please, without being forced into perfect, acceptable shapes by a gardener's shears. Alexander turned his head, truly looking at her. The charming, practiced mask he wore for the rest of the world, the one he used to keep everyone at a polite distance, was conspicuously absent. His eyes were sharp, curious, and unsettlingly genuine. You know a great deal about them, don't you? Roses, I mean. Botany was considered an acceptable pursuit for a lady of my former station, she said. The words slipped out before she could catch them, a tiny hint of her past, a hairline crack in her armor. She clamped her mouth shut, instantly regretting the admission. But instead of pressing for invasive details of her past, Alexander gently steered the conversation to the present, displaying a rare trait in the powerful men she had known. He actually listened. "And what do your botanical pursuits tell you about this disaster?" he asked, gesturing to the overgrown beds surrounding them. "They tell me that the soil is still rich, but the roots are choked," Celeste explained, her guard lowering just a fraction as she engaged with the academic subject. "They need to be pruned severely if they are to thrive again. Some must be cut back to the very base, especially that one." She pointed a gloved finger toward a massive, twisted bush near the center of the garden. Its branches were incredibly thick, covered in vicious thorns, but it was entirely devoid of leaves or blooms, standing like a gray skeleton among the green. Alexander's gaze followed her hand, and his expression softened into something resembling melancholy. "The Alba Maxima, a very rare white rose. It was my mother's absolute favorite." He stepped closer to the dead-looking branches. "It hasn't produced a single flower since the spring she died." The gardeners assumed the soil turned sour. Celeste felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in her chest. She looked at the desolate bush, then at the Duke, catching a brief, unguarded glimpse of a boy who had lost his mother and learned to lock his heart away in response. It was a profound vulnerability she had not expected to find in the formidable, untouchable Alexander Ashford. It made him dangerously human. "It is not dead," she said quietly, stepping up beside him without thinking. "If you look closely at the base, the wood is still green beneath the bark. It is merely dormant. It is protecting itself." Alexander turned to face her, closing the remaining physical distance between them. The faint scent of sandalwood, clean linen, and cold autumn air surrounded her, overwhelming her senses. He reached out toward a branch of a nearby crimson rose, his bare fingers brushing deliberately against a particularly sharp thorn. "Protecting itself from what?" he asked softly, his eyes fixed on hers. "From the cold, from the elements, from being cut again," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He moved his hand away from the branch, slowly bringing it near hers where it rested against her skirt. He did not touch her, but his bare fingers hovered mere inches from her gray cotton gloves. The air between their hands seemed to crackle, thick with words unspoken. She could almost feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Do you always wear the gloves, Celeste?" he asked. His voice had dropped to a low, intimate timbre that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. It was the first time he had used her given name, stripping away the formal titles that kept them safely apart. "Even here, where there is no one around to see you." She swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs, like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. "They are a necessity." "Against the dust of the library?" he challenged gently, his gaze dropping to her covered hands. "Against the thorns," she countered, her chin lifting slightly in defense. Alexander let out a soft, huffing laugh, a sound so unexpectedly self-deprecating and genuine that it caught her entirely off guard. I suppose I cannot blame you for that. I have been told by many that I am exceptionally thorny on my worst days and a complete nuisance on my best. Before she could stop herself, before the ironclad rules of her survival could intervene and remind her of the danger, Celeste smiled. It wasn't a polite, practiced curve of the lips meant to appease an employer. It was a genuine, radiant smile that reached her gray eyes, lighting up her face and transforming her austere, guarded features into something breathtakingly warm. Alexander froze, utterly captivated by the sight, his breath catching visibly in his throat. His hand twitched, moving a fraction of an inch closer to hers. For a single, suspended second in the overgrown garden, the walls were entirely gone. They were just a man and a woman, standing close enough to share a breath. Then, the realization of what she had done crashed over Celeste like a wave of freezing water. The phantom memory of her past humiliation flared in her mind. The warmth vanished instantly from her face, replaced by stark, paralyzing panic. She had let him in. She had shown him the woman beneath the gray dresses. The vulnerability was intolerable. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. She snatched her hand back, pressing it tightly against her chest, as if to physically hold her heart in place. "My 30 minutes have passed," she gasped, her voice breaking. "I must return to the catalogues immediately." "Celeste, wait!" Alexander started, his hand finally reaching out to catch her arm. But she was already turning, fleeing down the gravel path. Her skirts flew behind her as she ran back toward the safety of the dusty books and the stone walls, leaving Alexander standing alone in the overgrown garden, staring at the empty space she had left behind. For 3 days following the incident in the rose garden, the Duke of Ashford did not see his archivist. Celeste had weaponized her efficiency. She arranged her schedule with military precision, ensuring she was never in the corridors when Alexander took his morning coffee, and taking her meals exclusively in her chambers. When Alexander finally lost his patience and strode down to the East Wing on Tuesday afternoon, he found the heavy oak doors of the library locked from the inside. A polite, immaculately penned note had been slipped beneath the door. "Your Grace, the cataloging of the fragile 15th century manuscripts requires a dust-free and entirely undisturbed environment. I have requested that Mrs. Higgins leave my tea in the hall. All inquiries regarding the estate ledgers may be directed to her. Respectfully, C. Whitmore." Alexander stared at the crisp parchment, a muscle feathering along his jaw. He had been dismissed before, though rarely, and never with such chilling administrative finality. She was not simply hiding, she was severing the invisible thread that had begun to pull them together. By Thursday evening, the oppressive tension inside the house was matched by the weather outside. A fierce autumn storm rolled over the estate, lashing rain against the tall windows and sending freezing drafts through the sprawling corridors of Blackwood. Thunder rattled the glass, and the temperature inside the stone walls dropped sharply. Sitting in his study, Alexander watched the fire roar in the hearth, his mind entirely consumed by the woman shivering on the other side of the estate. He knew the East Wing. It was notoriously drafty, and he had not seen a servant carry coal down that corridor all afternoon. He stood up, abandoning his brandy. He did not care about propriety or her self-imposed rules anymore. When he reached the library doors, he didn't bother knocking. He produced the heavy brass master key from his waistcoat pocket, slid it into the lock, and turned it with a sharp, decisive click. The library was freezing. The heavy velvet curtains had not been drawn, and the lightning, illuminating the sky, cast long, monstrous shadows across the towering shelves. The fireplace was empty, completely dark. Celeste was sitting at the central table, huddled under a woolen shawl, a single candle flickering precariously beside her. She gasped as the door swung open, jumping to her feet. Because she had been working on repairing a fragile, water-damaged map, her hands were bare. Her gray cotton gloves rested on the edge of the table. In her panic, she reached for them, but her trembling fingers knocked one off the edge. It fluttered to the dark floorboards. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice betraying the tremor she fought so hard to conceal. "The door was locked, Your Grace." "The door is made of wood, Celeste. It is not a fortress," Alexander snapped, stepping into the room and closing it firmly behind him to block the draft from the corridor. He strode toward her, his dark eyes snapping with a mixture of anger and concern. "There is no fire in here. You are freezing. And you have been hiding from me for 3 days like a frightened child."
"I have been working,"
she countered, stepping backward until her spine hit the edge of the reading table. She clutched her remaining glove to her chest, her bare right hand gripping the edge of the mahogany wood so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I am fulfilling the terms of my employment. I asked not to be disturbed." "Do not insult my intelligence," he warned, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register as he closed the distance between them. He stopped just inches away, looming over her, a storm of frustrated energy. "This has nothing to do with 15th century manuscripts. Why did you run from me in the garden?" "Because I forgot my place," she said sharply, her chin lifting in a desperate show of defiance. "And it seems you have forgotten yours. You are my employer, Your Grace. Nothing more." "My title has never mattered less to me than it does at this exact moment, and it matters even less to you," Alexander said, refusing to let her hide behind formality. He looked down at her bare hand gripping the table, the pale skin exposed, devoid of its cotton armor. He slowly reached down and picked up the dropped glove from the floor. He did not hand it back to her. He held it in his fist. "You smiled at me. For 1 second, you lowered the drawbridge, and it terrified you so much, you decided to lock yourself in a freezing room rather than face me again." "Face what?" Celeste cried out, her voice finally breaking. The icy facade shattered, revealing the raw, panicked woman beneath. "Face a charming diversion? A temporary amusement for a duke who is bored in the country? Is that what you think this is?" Alexander asked, genuinely stung, his expression tightening. "I think that you are a man accustomed to getting exactly what you want," Celeste shot back, tears of sheer frustration prickling at the corners of her gray eyes. "And right now, you want to solve the puzzle of the quiet archivist. You want to see what is beneath the gloves. But I am not a puzzle, Alexander." The use of his Christian name slipped out in her anger, striking them both like a physical blow, but she couldn't stop. "I am a person who has already been broken once by a man who found me amusing until he found me inconvenient. I barely survived the humiliation of it." "I will not survive you." The absolute devastation in her voice paralyzed him. Alexander stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping into place. He had thought her distance was a challenge, a wall to be charmingly dismantled. He had not realized it was a matter of survival. He looked down at the gray glove in his hand, suddenly feeling like a trespasser. He had demanded she lower her defenses, but he had offered her absolutely nothing in return. He had remained safe behind his own armor of confidence, risking nothing, while demanding she risk everything. "Celeste," he began, his voice losing all its commanding edge, softening into something broken. He reached out, his hand hovering over her bare fingers trembling on the table. She pulled her hand away before he could make contact. With jerky, desperate movements, she reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. She thrust it toward his chest. "I wrote this yesterday, but I lacked the courage to deliver it," she said, her voice dropping to a hollow, defeated whisper. "I am giving my notice, Your Grace. The catalogue is organized enough for any clerk to finish. I will pack my things tonight and leave on the morning carriage." Alexander looked at the letter in her hand, then up at her face. The panic was gone, replaced by a devastating, hollow resolve. She had made her choice. "You are running away," he stated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I am protecting myself," she corrected quietly. "May I have my glove back, please?" Alexander stood frozen for a long moment, the roar of the rain pounding against the glass, the only sound in the freezing room. Slowly, feeling as though he were moving through deep water, he placed her cotton glove on the table, beside her formal letter of resignation. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the library, the heavy click of the closing door sounding exactly like an ending. The storm raged until the early hours of the morning, finally breaking to reveal a brittle, freezing dawn. Inside the study, the fire had long since burned out, leaving the room smelling of cold ash and damp stone. Alexander sat in the high-backed leather chair, staring at the small, neatly folded piece of parchment on his desk. Celeste's resignation letter. He had not slept. He had replayed her desperate, tear-filled accusation 100 times in the dark. "I will not survive you." For years, Alexander had prided himself on his impeccable control. He was the Duke of Ashford, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of high society with a detached, unfailing charm. He had thought himself infinitely superior to the men who let passion ruin their judgment. But sitting in the freezing study, stripped of his anger, he finally recognized the ugly truth. His charm was not a virtue. It was a shield. Celeste wore cotton gloves to keep the world from touching her. He wore a title and an effortless smile to do exactly the same thing. He had invaded her quiet life, demanded she lower her defenses, and pushed her to the point of panic, all while remaining completely, safely entrenched behind his own impenetrable walls. He had asked a woman who had already been broken to take a terrifying leap into the unknown, while he stood firmly on solid ground, risking absolutely nothing. No wonder she was running. He had given her no reason to believe he was safe. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 6. In 1 hour, the carriage would be brought to the front steps. Alexander stood up. He did not call for his valet. He did not put on a cravat or his heavy riding coat. In only his trousers and a rumpled white shirt, he walked out of the study and headed toward the heavy doors of the western terrace. The air outside was biting, the ground soft and muddy from the torrential rain. Alexander walked with single-minded purpose toward the abandoned rose garden. The storm had ravaged the wild beds, tearing down trellises and snapping weaker branches in half. He navigated the chaotic wreckage until he reached the center. The Alba Maxima stood exactly as it had days ago, a massive, gray skeleton of vicious thorns. Alexander did not hesitate. He reached into the dense center of the bush with his bare hands. The thorns immediately tore into the skin of his palms and the inside of his wrists, sharp and unforgiving. He did not pull back. With a harsh, tearing sound, he broke a thick piece of the dead-looking wood away from the base, ignoring the hot sting of his own blood. Inside the sprawling estate, Celeste was securing the leather straps of her small trunk. Her eyes were red and swollen, though she had long since stopped crying. The panic of the previous night had settled into a heavy, hollow ache in her chest. It was the feeling of a prisoner who had chosen solitary confinement to avoid the executioner. She was safe, she reminded herself. She was leaving before he could make her believe in a dream that would inevitably become a nightmare. She picked up her gray cotton gloves from the dresser. For the first time since she had bought them, she hesitated. As she slid the fabric over her fingers, the cotton felt different. It did not feel like armor anymore. It felt suffocating, like a cage she had willingly locked herself inside. She pushed the thought away, smoothing the wrinkles with practiced efficiency, and walked out of the room. The house was deadly quiet as she descended the grand staircase. 2 footmen carried her trunk out the front doors, the cold morning air rushing in to meet her. The carriage was waiting on the gravel drive, the horse's breath pluming in the freezing mist. "Everything is loaded, miss," the driver called out, pulling open the carriage door. Celeste nodded, pulling her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. She forced herself to look straight ahead, refusing to cast a final glance toward the east wing. She placed her gloved hand on the iron handle of the carriage, placing her foot on the first step. "Wait!" The single word cut through the morning mist, low and raspy, carrying absolutely no authority. It was not a command, it was a plea. Celeste froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head. Alexander was walking up the gravel drive from the direction of the Western Gardens. Celeste's eyes widened in sheer shock. The immaculate, untouchable Duke of Ashford was gone. His white shirt was dampened by the morning mist, unbuttoned at the collar. His boots were covered in mud. His hair fell across his forehead in untamed waves. But it was his hands that made her heart stop. They were covered in dirt and deep, angry red scratches. Blood smeared his knuckles and stained the cuffs of his white shirt. He stopped 5 paces away from her, keeping a deliberate, careful distance. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in the cold air, his dark eyes fixed on her face with a terrifying, raw intensity. "You accused me of playing a game from behind an impenetrable fortress," Alexander said, his voice rough. "You said I wanted to solve a puzzle, to see what was beneath your gloves, without risking anything myself. You were entirely correct." Celeste's hand tightened on the carriage door. She did not know what to do with this man. The script of her survival relied on him being arrogant and unfeeling. "When my mother died, this house became a tomb," Alexander continued, the words spilling out as if they had been locked in his chest for a decade. "I watched my father fall apart, and I learned a very simple, brutal lesson. Caring deeply only guarantees that you will eventually be destroyed. So I decided I would not care. I smiled, I entertained, I gave society exactly what it wanted, and I felt absolutely nothing. I made myself impossible to hurt. And in doing so, I made myself impossible to reach." He took a slow step forward, lifting his hands. "Until you," he whispered. Alexander opened his right hand. Resting on his bleeding, dirt-stained palm was a thick piece of the Alba Maxima rose. The outer gray bark had been violently stripped away, revealing the vibrant, undeniable bright green core beating with life inside. "You told me it was protecting itself from the cold," Alexander said, his eyes locking onto hers, wide and desperately sincere. "But if it stays dormant forever, Celeste, it is as good as dead. I have been dormant for years, and I am tired of being dead." He took one more step, stopping just out of arm's reach. He held the piece of green wood out to her. "I am not asking you to stay because I am a duke and I demand it," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I am standing here, bleeding, because I need you to know that I am just as terrified as you are. I am handing you the knife, Celeste. You have the power to destroy me entirely." He slowly lowered his hand, letting his arm fall to his side. He took a deliberate step backward, clearing her path to the open carriage door. "If you need to leave to be safe, I will not stop you," Alexander murmured, the absolute defeat in his posture, proving he meant every word. "But do not leave, believing you were just an amusement. You were the one who woke me up." Celeste stood paralyzed on the carriage step. The freezing wind whipped her skirts around her ankles, but she didn't feel the cold. She looked at Alexander's bleeding hands. He had torn down his own armor, piece by piece, and laid it in the mud at her feet. He had given her absolute power over his heart, knowing she was entirely capable of getting into the carriage and crushing it. He was safe. He was real. The driver cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably on the bench. "Miss, shall we depart?" Celeste looked down at her own gray cotton gloves. Then, she looked at the blood on Alexander's knuckles. Slowly, her fingers uncurled from the iron handle of the carriage door. She lowered her foot from the step, her boots touching the gravel drive. "Wait," Celeste whispered to the driver, her voice trembling but remarkably clear. She turned her body entirely toward Alexander, the heavy, hollow ache in her chest, instantly replaced by a terrifying, beautiful surge of hope. Celeste stepped completely away from the carriage, the crunch of the gravel echoing loudly in the damp morning air. Alexander did not move. He stood perfectly still, his breath frosting in the cold, honoring the promise he had just made. He had surrendered all control, leaving the space between them entirely open. If she wanted to walk away, he would not stop her. Celeste turned to the driver, who was still watching the scene with wide, uncertain eyes. "Unload the trunk, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice steadying with every syllable. "I will not be traveling to London today." The driver blinked, then tipped his hat hastily. "Right away, miss." As the heavy leather trunk was pulled from the back of the carriage, Celeste turned her attention fully to the Duke of Ashford. He let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a ragged sigh of relief, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch, though he still kept his distance, waiting for her. Celeste walked toward him. With every step, the hollow, suffocating panic that had ruled her life for the past year began to fracture, breaking apart like ice on a thawing river. She had built her entire existence around the belief that no man would ever bleed for her. She had convinced herself that she was nothing more than a temporary convenience to the world, a woman easily discarded the moment she became complicated. But here was Alexander, the most powerful man she had ever known, standing in the freezing mist with mud on his boots and her heart in his hands, terrified that she would leave him behind. She stopped barely a foot away from him, close enough to see the exhaustion shadowing his dark eyes, close enough to see the sharp, angry tears of the thorns on his skin. He held her gaze, offering no charming smile, no practiced words of persuasion. He was entirely bare. Celeste looked down at her hands. The gray cotton gloves suddenly felt unbearably heavy. For months, they had been her armor, her excuse, her constant reminder to never let the world touch her directly. But looking at the man in front of her, she realized she no longer wanted to hide. Slowly, deliberately, she pinched the fingertips of the left glove. She pulled. The cotton slid smoothly off her skin. She let it fall, watching the gray fabric hit the wet gravel. Alexander's breath hitched, his eyes tracking the movement. She raised her right hand and did the same. The second glove joined the first in the mud, abandoned and useless. The morning air bit fiercely at her bare skin, but Celeste didn't care. She reached out, her hands trembling slightly, and gently wrapped her fingers around Alexander's. The shock of the contact was electric. His skin was cold from the morning air, rough with the fresh scratches, yet impossibly warm beneath the surface. He let out a low, shuddering breath at the sensation of her bare palms pressing against his. For a moment, neither of them moved, simply anchoring themselves in the profound, quiet reality of the touch. "You are bleeding," she whispered, her thumb brushing delicately over a dark scratch on his wrist. "It is entirely worth it," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. He carefully turned his hands, lacing his fingers through hers, securing his grip as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He looked down at their joined hands, then up into her striking gray eyes. "I promise you, Celeste, I will never be careless with you." "I know," she answered softly, and for the first time in a very long time, it was the absolute truth. She looked at the piece of green wood, still resting against their intertwined fingers. "I was so terrified of being a distraction, of being a puzzle you would abandon once you solved it." "You were never a puzzle," Alexander murmured, bringing her hands up to his chest, pressing her knuckles right over the steady, heavy beat of his heart. "You were the only thing that made sense to me, since the day you walked into that library. I do not want to be untouched anymore, Celeste. I only want you." A genuine, radiant smile broke across Celeste's face, entirely devoid of panic, pushing away the last remnants of the freezing dawn. She stepped closer, letting the warmth of his body shield her from the wind. Alexander lowered his head, his lips pressing a tender, reverent kiss against her bare knuckles, sealing the silent promise between them. He didn't care who saw them. He didn't care about the cold, or the mud, or the estate staff watching from the windows. He had risked everything, and he had won the only thing that mattered. "Come," he said softly, keeping her hand firmly locked in his. "You are freezing, and there is no fire lit in the library." "Then we shall have to light one," Celeste replied. They turned toward the grand stone steps of Blackwood, leaving the gray cotton gloves behind in the mud, two forgotten ghosts of a past they no longer needed. 6 months later, the heavy oak doors of the East Wing Library stood wide open. The oppressive, dusty gloom of the previous autumn was entirely gone. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, in brilliant, unobstructed beams, warming the rich mahogany shelves and the patterned carpets. The scent of aged leather remained, but it was now mingled with the fresh, sweet breeze blowing in from the open terrace doors. Celeste sat at the central reading table, a massive ledger open before her. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, and her bare hands moved gracefully across the pages, checking the final dates of the catalogue. She did not startle when the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor. She didn't tense her shoulders or look for an escape route. She simply smiled, setting her quill down as Alexander walked into the room. He was not holding a fictional excuse about Greek architecture or tenancy laws. He walked with the effortless, relaxed grace of a man who no longer had anything to hide. Alexander approached the table, his eyes soft and entirely devoted as they locked onto hers. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out his hand, placing an object gently on the open ledger in front of her. It was a single, perfect white rose. Celeste gasped softly, her fingers brushing the velvety petals. The Alba Maxima. It had bloomed. "The gardeners are in absolute shock," Alexander said, leaning his hip against the edge of the reading table, reaching out to trace the curve of her bare jaw. They were convinced it was a lost cause. "They simply did not know how to wait for it," Celeste murmured, turning her face into his palm, pressing a kiss to the faint, silvery scar that still marked his wrist. Alexander smiled, the charming, impenetrable mask of the Duke, forever replaced by the quiet, grounded love of the man beneath it. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, tender kiss that tasted of sunlight and absolute certainty. They had both learned the hardest lesson of all, that true safety was never found in hiding behind walls, but in finding the one person worth tearing them down for.